Today, inshallah, we are going to complete Chapter 4, which is the aggregate output or the aggregate expenditure and the equilibrium output. So let's start with the following formula to understand the topic that we are going to discuss in this class. As you know that the GDP or the gross domestic product equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, right? GDP is what? Is the aggregate output, or Y, equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, right? Suppose that we work under the economy where there is no government and no relation with the international countries or the other countries. So in this case, the aggregate output would equal what? C plus I. So in the economy, suppose that we work under the closed economy. Closed economy means that we work inside the country. All of our output purchased or sold inside, or and we don't have a government. So in this case, the aggregate output, or Y, equals C plus I. I is what? Is the planned investment. I is the planned investment. Right? Okay. As you know that the investment is the purchasing of the business sector, and like purchasing spare parts, building a new building new houses, a new building, purchasing new equipment, new machines. All these are called what? Investment, right? Okay, so let's go to analyze the relationship between this is, as you know, this is aggregate output C plus I. So let's go to the structure of, or the investment line. As you see, this is the planned investment. Suppose that the business sector decided to invest by $25 million. In this case, it's called the planned investment. As you see, there is no relationship between Y and I. If Y, or aggregate income, increase, there is no change in the planned investment, because we decided to invest by $25 million, right? Okay. Let's go to this diagram. Or, yes. As you see, the blue line is what? C. Right? And the red line here is I, the planned investment. C plus I. Suppose that C started from 100, which is A. C, at this point, the A in the consumption function equals what? C. As you know, C equals A plus BY. A, in this case, equals $100 million, right? And I equals 25. So C plus I equals how much? 125. This is the autonomous aggregate expenditure, right? Let's come back to this formula to explain something. As I mentioned that, or as you see, this is aggregate output. Y is the aggregate output. C plus I. C is what? The demand for households, or the aggregate demand for the households, and I is the planned investment, or the demand for investment for the business sector. صح? So this is what? The aggregate demand And this is the aggregate supply. Or this is the aggregate expenditure. So C plus I is what? The aggregate expenditures for the household sector and the business sector, when there is no government and no relation or a closed economy. And aggregate, this is aggregate supply or aggregate output. Right? Suppose that we produced a 1,000 cars. This is what? This is the aggregate supply or the aggregate output, right? And suppose the aggregate demand or the aggregate expenditure was 600 cars. So here we have what? Excess supply of goods, right? This means we have a surplus of 400 cars goes to what? Or go to which? Where this is, or the excess supply of cars, where can we, or how can we use with that or deal with that? Exactly. So the excess supply will go to inventory. So in this case we have a positive, a change in business inventory, right? So we have a business or a surplus or a positive, a change in business inventory. The change in business inventory, it's called the unplanned inventory change. بيسموها هيك. Unplanned change in business inventory or unplanned inventory change. So the unplanned change in business inventory would be positive or would increase. صح؟ لأنه الفاضل اللي عندي هذا ال 400 سيارة وين بدنا نوديهم؟ على الانفنتوري. صح ولا لا؟ طيب suppose that y equals, or so in this case y is larger than C plus I, or the aggregate output is larger than the aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. So we have excess outputs or excess supply, so they will go to the inventory. So we have a positive change in business inventory. But if y is smaller than C plus I, if y, suppose that we produced 1,000 cars and the demand for cars, or the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure for cars, was 1,200 cars. So exactly we have a negative change in business inventory, right? لأنه هناخد ال 200 سيارة هدول من المخازن عشان نغطي هاي. مظبوط ولا لا؟ صح؟ But where is, or does the equilibrium achieved when y equals the aggregate expenditure? صح؟ So the equilibrium occurs or achieved. The equilibrium, yes. Which one? Here? Yes. As I mentioned, y is what? The aggregate output or the aggregate supply. C plus I is the aggregate expenditure or the aggregate demand, right? If y, or the aggregate supply, is larger than the aggregate demand, or the aggregate output is larger than the aggregate expenditure, we have what? We have what? Excess supply. وين بنوديه هذا excess supply? على inventory. صح? So in this case we have a positive, a change in business inventory, or the unplanned, هذا غير مخطط. Unplanned inventory change would be positive. صح? Or would increase or rise. مظبوط ولا لا؟ But in this case, suppose that we produce 1,000 cars and the demand for cars or the aggregate expenditure was for 1,200. In this case, what would happen? We have a shortage. We have a deficit. So we have to meet the excess demand for products from the inventory. So the unplanned inventory change would be negative or would decline. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ But yes, but if, or the equilibrium occurs when y equals C plus I, or the aggregate output equals the aggregate expenditure or the aggregate supply. Sorry, aggregate demand. اللي أنتجنا صار في عليه طلب خلصنا. This is the equilibrium output, right? Okay. So let's go. So as you see, let's come back to this diagram or this graph. This is the blue area. The blue line is the consumption function. C equals 100 plus 0.75y, right? And our assumption is that we have a planned investment of $25 million. So C plus I equals how much? C plus I equals 125. This is what? This is the autonomous aggregate expenditure. And هذا C plus I is what? Is the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure function. It starts from 125 and it has the same slope of the consumption function. Right? صح? So the MBC here for the consumption function is the same marginal propensity to consume for the aggregate expenditure function. صح؟ بس من وين الاختلاف؟ في نقطة الانطلاق في الانترسبت here. Right? Okay. As you see, here we are talking about the equilibrium aggregate output or aggregate income. The equilibrium occurs when Y equals aggregate expenditure, or when Y equals, or the aggregate output equals the aggregate expenditure, C plus I, right? But as you see, if Y is larger than C plus I, or the aggregate output is larger than the aggregate expenditure or the planned aggregate expenditure. In this case, as you see, the analysis is the aggregate output is larger than the planned aggregate expenditure, and we have what? The inventory investment is greater than the planned. In this case, we have what? A positive change in business inventory. يعني احنا عمليا يعني الانفنتوري صار positive. ومستثمرين الاكشوال انفستمنت is greater than the planned. عمليا مستثمرين اكثر من اللي مخططين له. طب what about the second case when Y is smaller than the aggregate expenditure or the aggregate demand is larger than Y, the aggregate output or the aggregate expenditure here is larger or greater than the aggregate output. في عندي طلب كثير والعرض قليل. Yeah, exactly. So we have, this means the planned aggregate expenditure is larger than the aggregate output, or the aggregate output is smaller than the aggregate expenditure. وبالتالي من وين هذا بيكون في عندي؟ As you see, the inventory investment is smaller than the planned, and the actual investment is smaller than the planned expenditure. So let's take the following exercise to understand the idea well. As you see, we have the following consumption function, which equals, or C equals 100 plus 0.75, and the planned investment is, or equals 25. The question is, or as you see here, this is the aggregate output Y, the aggregate consumption at different levels of Y, how much? At, or when Y equals 100, how much is the consumption? We have to calculate C. C in the first case, as you see, C equals 100 plus 0.75 Y. At Y equals 100, how much is C? C equals 100 plus 0.75 times 100 equals 100 plus 75 equals 175. This is the first case. And the second case, the same. At Y equals 200. How much is the consumption? The same. So C2, this is C1. C2 equals 100 plus 0.75 times 200 equals how much? 225. The same. And the same for all cases, right? let's calculate the planned aggregate expenditure. The planned aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure. The planned aggregate expenditure equals C plus I. Exactly. So, and I here is constant. At all cases, at all values of Y, I is constant. The planned investment is constant. Right? So, to calculate this, this is Y, C, and this is I. The planned investment is constant at all levels of Y. The planned aggregate expenditure, الانفاق الكلي المخطط قديش? How much? Equals C plus I. So C, 175 for the first case, plus 25 equals 200. 250 plus 25 equal 275, and so on. Right? Let's do a comparison between the aggregate output and the aggregate planned aggregate expenditure at all levels or at all cases. The first case. And then we will determine the equilibrium point. So in the first case, Y. So we are going to do a comparison between Y and C plus I. The equilibrium, as we mentioned, occurs when Y is or equals C plus I. This is the aggregate output equals the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure. At this point, we have equilibrium, right? But if Y is larger than aggregate demand, we have positive unplanned change in business inventory, right? So in the first case, as you see, the unplanned inventory change equals Y minus aggregate expenditure. To calculate the unplanned inventory change, تغير في المخزون بدنا نشوفه هل هو positive or negative, equals the aggregate output minus aggregate expenditure. صح؟ Is if the aggregate output is larger or greater than the aggregate expenditure, so we have it should be positive, and otherwise it would be negative or zero. So for the first case, Y 100 minus 200. This is the aggregate, the planned aggregate expenditure. 100 minus 200 equals minus 100. Minus. This is minus 100. So there is no equilibrium. Right? What about the second case? 200 minus 275 equals minus 75, and so on. Sorry? Negative, because Y is smaller than the aggregate expenditure. As you know that if Y, the aggregate output, is larger than the aggregate demand, we have a positive change in business inventory, or the unplanned change in business inventory is positive. But if Y, our product or our output, is smaller than the aggregate demand, بدنا ناخد من وين؟ من inventory, or should be negative. So as you see in this case, which is greater? Y is smaller than the aggregate demand or the aggregate expenditure. So in this case, we have what? A negative unplanned inventory change. Right? So there's no equilibrium. Right? What about the second case? 200 and so on. The third one and the fourth one.
There is an equilibrium.
At 500. For the fourth case. Y equals $500 million. And the aggregate demand or the planned aggregate expenditure equals how much? C plus I, 500. So Y, the aggregate outputs, equals the aggregate demand or the planned aggregate expenditure. So in this case, we have an equilibrium. Right? After that, 600 Y is larger or greater than the aggregate demand. So we have what?
Surplus supply.
Exactly, surplus supply, or the positive a change, unplanned change in business inventory or inventory change. صح؟ واضحة الأمور شباب ولا مش واضحة؟ مين حابب أعيد له؟ Yes.
بالنسبة للانفنتوري تشينج القياس تبعها.
Sorry.
الانبلان.
Yes. ماله؟
القانون الثابت تبعها.
Yes, yes, it equals Y, the aggregate output minus the planned aggregate expenditure. Yes, so the formula for the unplanned, the change in business inventory equals Y minus aggregate expenditure. So the unplanned inventory change equals Y, the aggregate output minus aggregate expenditure, or the planned aggregate expenditure, or Y minus C plus I, right? If we have government, it should be included in the aggregate expenditure. If we have the rest of the word, for sure, it should be added to the planned aggregate expenditure, as you will see in the next chapter, inshallah. So the equilibrium occurs or achieved at only or at the fourth case. So here we have equilibrium when Y, or the aggregate output, equals the aggregate expenditure, right? Is there a problem so far? Okay, let's go to another issue. As you see in this diagram, this is Y, which starts from 0, right? The Y function, this is Y, and this is what? The aggregate expenditure, or the planned aggregate expenditure function, which is C plus I. Starts from 125, right? Where is the equilibrium achieved, as you see? When Y equals aggregate expenditure. This is the equilibrium point, right? Suppose it was point E as equilibrium. Yes, yes, exactly. So the equilibrium, as you see, achieved when the Y, or aggregate output, equals the aggregate expenditure, or the planned aggregate expenditure. Let us see the point at the right hand of a point E. طلع لي ذاك اليمين هنا. Which is a greater, Y or the aggregate expenditure? Y, yes. So at the right hand, we can see that Y is a greater than aggregate expenditure, or the planned aggregate expenditure, or Y is larger than C plus I. So we have what? Exactly, and exactly the unplanned, a change in business inventory would what? Yes, positive. So unplanned rises in inventory, بزيد اللي هو الهاي. But what about the output في هذه الحالة? It should decline. صح؟ لأنه أصلا أنا في عندي فائض في الإنتاج، وبالتالي الأوتبوت would decline, right? So in this case, Y is a greater than aggregate expenditure. In this case, the unplanned rises in inventory, and the output would fall to reach the equilibrium. Yes, 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 the same idea. So to reach the equilibrium, the output should what? Decline. To reach the point where Y equals aggregate expenditure. At the left hand, what do you see? This is point along what? The aggregate expenditure, and this is point along Y. So Y is smaller than the aggregate expenditure. So Y at the left hand, aggregate expenditure is larger than the planned aggregate expenditure is larger than Y. So to reach the equilibrium, Y should increase. So we have to increase Y from 200 here to 500, right? And we have a declining in the unplanned inventory. صح؟ مظبوط يا شباب؟ unplanned change in business inventory هينزل. مظبوط؟ And we have to increase the aggregate outputs from 200 to 500 to reach the equilibrium. Right? مين عنده مشكلة يا شباب؟ في شيء ambiguous حسينه؟ تمام. Let's go to practical exercise. As you see, suppose that we have the following formula: C equals 100 plus 0.75y, and I, the planned investment, equals 25. The question is, calculate or derive the aggregate, the equilibrium output, the equilibrium aggregate output. As you know that y at equilibrium, y must equal aggregate expenditure, or y equals C plus I, right? Tamam? So y equals C, direct substitution, 100 plus 0.75y plus aggregate planned investment to 25. So y 125 plus 0.75y. عمل shifting. So 1y minus 0.75 y equals 125. So 0.25 y equals 125. So y equals 125 over 0.25 equals how much? $500 million. This is the equilibrium aggregate output, right? And as you see, it's illustrated here. حاضر. Hey. As you see, the consumption function is given, the planned investment is given, right? The question is, calculate or derive the equilibrium output, the equilibrium aggregate output, determine or derive. So as you know, in the formula, the equilibrium occurs when y equals aggregate expenditure, or the aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. So y equals C plus I. C is 100 plus 75y plus I, which is 25, right? So y equals 100 plus 25 equals 125 plus 0.75y, right? I'm shifting al y here. بصير عندنا the summation, or 1y minus 0.70y equals 125. So 0.25y equals 125. So y equals 500. Right? This is the equilibrium. What? The equilibrium aggregate output. Hey, the equilibrium output occurs when y equals 500 or $500 million. Go to the following exercise. As you see, the aggregate output is given, the aggregate consumption is given, and the planned investment is given as well. The question is, derive the aggregate expenditure. This is the first question. Derive or calculate the aggregate expenditure. Yes, yes. The aggregate expenditure equals C plus I. The aggregate expenditure equals C plus I. So C plus I, the first case, 300 plus 100, this is aggregate expenditure. For the first case, $400 million, 550, 700, 850, and $1,000 million. Right? Let's go to the exercises or the requirements. The first question is, at an aggregate output level of $400 billion, the planned expenditure equals how much? At $400 billion, the aggregate expenditure 550. That's it. At aggregate level of output $800 billion, how much is the aggregate saving? Aggregate saving. Aggregate saving equals what? Y minus C. Y minus C. At $800 billion, saving equals Y minus C. 800 minus $750. So the aggregate saving equals what? How much? 50. at aggregate output level of $200 billion. The unplanned inventory change is how much? So we have to derive or to calculate exactly Y minus aggregate expenditure to calculate or to derive the planned unplanned change in business inventory equals what? Y minus aggregate expenditure at all cases, and then we can easily calculate answer the questions. So Y minus aggregate expenditure, Y minus 200, and then 400 minus 550 minus 150, and then 600 minus 700 100 minus 100, 800 minus 500. Sorry. 800 minus 50, and then 0, right? So where's the equilibrium point? The question is, where is or determine the equilibrium point? At Y equals 1000, because at this point Y equals aggregate expenditure. Above this point we have what? Negative on a change in business inventory, or the unplanned inventory change. All these cases, or all these points, we have a negative unplanned change in business inventory, right? في مشكلة. نعم. Yes, C plus I. Aggregate expenditure equals C plus I. So as you see, at an aggregate output level of $200 billion, the unplanned inventory change is how much? At 200, we have minus $200 billion. What else? The equilibrium level of aggregate output equals how much? $1,000, right? The MBC in this economy is how much? Is it easy to derive or to calculate the marginal propensity to consume? Yes. MBC equals what? Exactly. MBC equals delta C over delta Y, or delta aggregate expenditure over delta Y. The same result, right? Because as you see that the slope of the consumption function is the same slope of aggregate expenditure function. So here, suppose this is Y2, Y1, C1, C2, easily delta C over delta Y. So 150 over 200 equals how much? 0.75. تمام? Okay, شباب. As you know that for the household, Y equals C plus S, right? And for the business sector, if we work under the closed economy with no government, Y at equilibrium, Y equals what? C plus I, right? If we have the same Y, in this case, C plus S equals C plus I at equilibrium, right? Because the first side or the left side, Y, C plus S must equal C plus I at equilibrium. So deduct C. So at equilibrium, S must equals I. Saving must equal the planned investment at equilibrium, right? So at equilibrium, the saving must equal the planned investment. مين عنده مشكلة؟ ها؟ في مشكلة؟ We are talking about the same economy. So we are talking about the same output, or the same income, the same aggregate income. C plus S, C plus I, deduction for C, so S must equal I at the or when we work. Yes, about the for the first case, we are talking about the household sector, where we are talking about aggregate income, And we, as you mentioned, that aggregate income equals the aggregate output, right? So this is for the household, for the business sector. When aggregate income equals C plus I, the aggregate output C plus I.
كيف تساوي السيفنج تاع العائلات الانفستمنت تاع
هذا at equilibrium, sometimes not. We will see. We have a term which is leakages out and injection. Injection and leakages out. Injection and leakages out. Injection means حقن. Leakages out means تسرب. Suppose that we work under the open economy and we have a government. We have a government and we work under the open economy. If the government spends money for what would happen to the aggregate output? Would increase. So there is a positive relationship between the government spending and output, right? What about the taxes? Negative, right? Because increasing the taxes شو بتعمل في الاوتبوت؟ decline. So the government spending اللي هو الجي is classified as injection. بنحقن في الاقتصاد. Just a moment, I would bring something. As you see, this is a needle, right? And suppose that we would like to do an injection for the economy, and I'm the government. If I inject means spend money in the economy, the aggregate output would increase, right? So it's called injection in the economy, right? So as you see, the G is the government spending has a positive relationship with the aggregate output, right? Like, what about the taxes? So it's classified as injection. The government spending is classified as what? Injection. طيب ايش بيقابلها taxes? It's a leakages out because we absorb or we cut taxes, right? So in this case the aggregate output would decline. So there is a negative relationship between the taxes and the government output or the aggregate output. وبالتالي it's classified as what? Leakages out. تمام؟ طيب what about investment? The investment, if the business invests more and more in the economy, is it classified as injection or leakages out? Injection. يقابلها saving. Leakages out. Right? تسرب. Right? What else? C plus I plus G. Export and import. Export and import. Export. Injection and imports is classified as leakages out. Right? المصطلح واضح ولا مش واضح؟ موضوع الانجكشن أي شيء بيزيد الأوتبوت وبالتالي is classified as injection for the economy. أي شيء بيعمل تسرب بيكون ضمن is classified as a leakages out. Yes. Right? طيب. So okay, is clear. So as you see here, why? as we mentioned that at equilibrium, I must equal, or the planned investment must equal the saving, right? At equilibrium, saving must equal the planned investment, صح؟ مظبوط. In this case, the leakages out must equal injections, صح? Because the saving is what? Leakages out, or leakages, and the investment is injection. So at equilibrium, leakages out equals injection. But if the saving was larger than investment, if saving is larger than investment, we have what? Leakages out is larger or greater than injection, and vice versa. We will see at the diagram here. In this diagram, as you see, this is what? The planned investment, and this is the aggregate saving, or the saving. The aggregate saving starts from minus 100. The planned investment starts from 25. Where is the equilibrium achieved? When S equals I at $500 million or $1 billion. صح? At this point, suppose this is point E. At the right hand, saving is larger than the planned investment. So we have what? Leakages out is larger than or greater than injection. At the left side, what do you see? Investment is larger or greater than saving. So what? Injection is greater than leakage out. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ طب at the right hand, we have a positive or rises in the on a plan, the change in business inventory, or fall in the on a plan. No. Let's come back to the. I will come back to the. Here, as you see, the unplanned rises in inventory, and the output would fall. Yes, yes, I understood what you see. So, when Y is larger than aggregate expenditure, what do you see? S must larger than or greater than I. صح؟ هيو. So if at this point, at the right hand, this is Y, and this is aggregate expenditure, which is greater? Y is larger than the aggregate expenditure. صح? Or saving is larger than I, because Y equals what? At the right hand here, Y equals what? C plus S. Y, at the right hand here, Y is greater than aggregate expenditure, and Y equals C plus S. Right? But aggregate expenditure equals what? C plus I. Right? When Y is larger than the aggregate expenditure, what do you see? C plus S is larger than C plus I. Or S larger than I. So if the aggregate output is larger than the aggregate expenditure, what do you see? Saving is larger than planned investment, right? And in this case, the unplanned rises in inventory, and Y should decline from $800 billion to $500 billion, right? And vice versa for sure, if it was smaller. تمام؟ And the Y would increase in this case. تمام؟ صعب الأمور ولا فيش ambiguous؟